want to know about the Bible being reliable. Why do we think that the Bible is reliable?
Yeah, so my argument that the Bible is true, right? We first have to define our terms, right? So when I talk about the Bible, I'm talking about the 66 books written by 44 different people over 1,500 years, right?
Yeah, appreciate that, because there are different Bibles. Appreciate that.
Yes, yeah. And then with that, we also need to define what we're talking about when we say truth. So the definition of truth that I'd like to use is it's in accordance with reality. Can we agree on that?
Yeah, I'm totally fine with that.
Yeah. So if we want to look at the Bible and we want to say, okay, is this in accordance with reality? We need to look at a lot of different things. We need to look at, okay, does it fit the time of the day? Does it match up geographically? Does it match up with other sources? Can we compare it to other things and see, okay, is this matching up? And if we take the Bible, it does that for any passage at any time. Are you familiar with the Gospel of Luke?
Yes, I am familiar with the Gospel of Luke.
Yeah. So the Gospel of Luke in chapter 3, you don't mind if I read it just a small snippet here real quick?
If you feel it's relevant, yeah. Yeah.
All right. So this is going to sound like it drags on, but I promise this is essential. So it says, in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate being governor of Judea, and Herod being tetrarch of Galilee, and his brother Philip tetrarch of the region of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Lycinus tetrarch of Abilene, during the high priesthood of Annas and Saphias, the word of God came to John, son of Zechariah, in the wilderness. So that seems like a bunch of jumble, right? But at the same time, are you aware who Lucian is?
Yes, I'm aware of Lucian. And, and I think this is an argument that gets brought up when talking about specifically the Gospel of Luke, right? There's some other stuff that comes in there. Is the sort of dating of some of these people that lived in these historical timeframes. One, an issue that kind of comes into conflict is the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke sort of differ in some of the dates there. But larger problem than that, even, I would say, is that none of the Gospels are written in the time frame in which they are writing about. There is a 40-year minimum at least between the Gospel of Mark, which is often cited as the earliest gospel written, and the time in which it took place, right? It's like 70 AD is like the earliest date that biblical scholars will give to Mark. And Mark is the earliest one. Luke comes a little bit later, around like 80 AD, I think, tied up with Matthew. And then Gospel of John starts at like 90 to like 100. So, it can give some facts about some historical figures, but everything else that it talks about is like eyewitness events, right? Eyewitness events that don't seem to be written by the eyewitness. So that's one of the biggest problems I have with the Gospels, is that they claim to sort of be these eyewitness accounts that don't seem to match up with each other, and also, aren't eyewitnesses, according to people who have studied this for way longer than I have.
Yeah, so that first part that you mentioned there, can you repeat that? What was the first? Sorry, can you repeat that first part? I heard your second point. I was thinking about the first point. What did you say?
Yeah, I have a tendency to talk a lot. So, I may have made a couple of different points in there, but I guess, the gospel accounts themselves seem to differ in some of the time frames and stories that they talk about, right? So the Gospel of Matthew has this whole narrative about escaping from Egypt and who's ruling at this time and what's happening with the birth of Christ. And, there's also sort of this virgin story that gets added in later in John and stuff, right? So already in the first couple of chapters in all of the Gospels, there really are accounting for different events, sometimes using the same people, but sometimes talking about different people as well.
Yeah, so with any kind of writing, we have to be aware of what are they trying to accomplish, right? So we look at the Gospel of Matthew compared to the Gospel of Luke. right? Or even the Gospel of Mark, and they have different purposes. And the differentiations in detail don't amount, I believe, to contradictions. So you talked about the idea, right? The story of how Jesus had to escape from Herod to go to Egypt, or he had to escape from Herod by going to Egypt.
Correct. Yeah.
That's not a differentiation in detail that amounts to like, oh, this isn't true, right? If you're looking at the Gospels and if they matched up perfectly, you could accuse them of corroborating, and then it would lose its reliability. So I think that the fact that they're different in slight manners, differentiations, I think that proves really the reliability of them, right? It's the idea of, okay, like if you're cheating on a test, right?
Yeah. Can I throw this at you? Because you also know that these aren't the only gospels of Jesus that exist, right? There's other gospels that have been written. And you're right. They all have different purposes, right? They all have different evangelical sort of ideas that they want to get out, sort of describing the theology of Jesus, what he's about, you know, what he's set to accomplish, what we should take from it, right? But my argument is, that's separate from talking about truth, right? I think that these gospels do have similarities. And in fact, there is evidence that Matthew and Luke do take from each other in some respects. They do have similarities because they are taking these ideas and also transforming them to push them on their own narratives. And we know this to be a fact, right? We know this to be a fact because there are other gospels of Jesus, right? Gospel of Thomas, and all kinds of other early Gnostic texts and stuff that do accomplish that. And most people, Christians today, don't take these as fact, don't take these as describing anything true about reality or anything true about what Jesus has said or done. I just go one step further and say, I think that's true for the commonly accepted gospels as well, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so sort of going into the fact that there are other gospels out there, just because they're gospel, like just because they're written doesn't mean that they're true, right? They're not part of the canon.
Yeah.
Right. So you can look at the Gospel of Thomas, and it has huge contradictions with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Whereas, right, or even right, you can look at the end of the Gospel of Thomas, right, and it says basically every woman who makes herself male enters the kingdom of heaven. Right. Mm-hmm. That's not at all what Jesus preached. And if you actually go and you look at the texts, right, and you go and you investigate them, it turns out that the Gospel of Thomas is a known forgery. Right. So now you have to ask yourself, okay, you know this isn't reliable. So what makes these four reliable? Right. It's not just because I'm not going to make the argument, well, I believe it, that God.
Mikhail, it's interesting you say that. And I'm sorry, I'm interrupting again, and please forgive my rudeness, but I'm just eager to talk about this because, like, I think the Gospels do contradict each other in quite significant details and do have significant narratives. The example I'll give is the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of John are functionally extremely different Gospels of Jesus. Mark doesn't even talk about the resurrection, right? Mark, every time Jesus is doing his miracles and talking to people, he's saying, hey, don't tell anybody about this. Don't say anything about me being the Messiah, right? I'm just kind of here for you guys and to kind of live my truth. Whereas John's like, yes, I am the Son of God. And like, I'm out here doing stuff and nobody can get to heaven except through me, right? And these are like very different sort of theological narratives that are happening. So, you know, Thomas, you point out correctly that is a known forgery. But, you know, I would go as further as to say that the supposed eyewitness accounts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are also not written by eyewitnesses. And I also think that gospel scholars agree with me on this, that there's no way that these could have been written by eyewitness accounts. Maybe originally stories from eyewitnesses, you could make that argument. But as far as what's written pen to paper, not the same thing. They're written posthumously, gotta be 40 years after the events of what's going on here, or if not posthumously, at least when people would not have the recollection to talk about things in such a detail that the Gospels tend to make. So, but I'm talking a lot here. I don't want to take up the whole conversation.
Mikhail, are you here?
Sorry
Okay.
about that. So,
Yeah, go ahead.
do you mind? Sorry, I hope I didn't interrupt you there. But you said the Gospel of Mark doesn't even talk about the resurrection.
Yeah, the
Mark-
resurrection stories, the post-resurrection stories, like aren't really a thing in Mark.
So the stories of what he did after the resurrection might not be included, but when we look at history, right, what does Lucian say is important when you're writing history, right? He says include the important things, cut out the fluff. So we have to look at, okay, what was Mark trying to accomplish with his gospel? Why didn't he include these things? That doesn't amount to a contradiction, and it doesn't amount to the fact that the Bible, like the Gospels are different, right? Was Mark trying to accomplish the same things as Matthew was? No, Matthew was trying to show that Jesus was going to be a new David and a new Moses, right? That's why the genealogies look different as well, because in order to understand the Bible, you also have to understand the language. And when we look at the language and we look at the fact that Matthew was trying to display Jesus as a new David, so every Hebrew name has a number associated with it. And David's number was 14. And when you line up and you look at the text of the genealogies in Matthew, they line up to 3 rows of 14. So if you were Hebrew reading that at the time, you would be like, oh, Jesus, David, right? They would be associated with one another. Matthew would have been trying to show, okay, Jesus is the new David, and Hebrew would have understood that.
Would they have called him
language.
Jesus? I mean, his name was not his name. You're saying Jesus. Are you talking about like the original translation of Jesus' name? Would that have lined up with David, or is it just so happened that the Europeanization of the name of Jesus ends up lining up with David?
Well, I mean, he's talking about the genealogies, right? There's a genealogies in both that have different lines of succession.
I
from
see.
Jesus
Okay.
to David.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
But it's interesting that this is brought up because, like, you're making this point sort of without me having to make it, which is that these genealogies are different in both of the Gospels, which I think is another example of why these stories are just that they're stories. Because you can make some argument that these are serving some sort of literary purpose, that, if we do this numerologically, then there's some sort of significance there and a meaning there. But that doesn't change the fact that the factual truth of that genealogy is wrong, right? Like the actual state of affairs that the genealogies claim are different, right? And so they are not compatible with each other.
Yeah, so just because they're different, like I said earlier, just because there's a differentiation in detail doesn't mean that they're contradicting. Just because Matthew's not saying, okay, they gave birth to this person. He's not saying, okay, that's completely different in somebody. What he's actually doing is he's mushing. I
think this is a Christian narrative. I'm going to be honest. This is a Christian idea that isn't historical. I don't think. I like this idea that we can just come up with genealogies and say, hey, actually, I know this says that I'm related to William Shakespeare, but I'm just trying to make the point that I'm the next great poet. Maybe that worked for the Jewish people at the time. That still doesn't mean that it's right? That's still just a narrative that's being given out there, right? And that's what seems to be done when linking Jesus to David in this way, and why I'm extremely skeptical of it. And at the end of the day, if I present you two different genealogies of where I come from, they can't both be right? That's just not how genealogies work. I either come from one person or I don't. And the text is very clear on the narrative that it's trying to make here. I think you're right. I think those authors are trying to make a sort of literary connection there, but that also means we can't trust it as a reality, right?
I wouldn't be so quick to say that, because if you study Hebrew and you study the culture of the day, you'll know that was pretty common, and it was pretty common in other cultures at that time as well. They're not playing loose and fast with the data, but what they're doing is they're not completely contradicting each other. Like I said, Matthew he's mushing together lines of people. He's not taking them out. He's not putting different ones in, but what he's doing is he might be cutting something out that's not important if he's trying to trying to make a detail. And if you study Hebrew, you study that culture, you'll know that that's true. So the fact that
I'm sorry. Let me
genealogies
step in before I get a little too lost, because I'm a little and I admit I'm not quite sure what's going on here. So I thought before you were trying to make like some kind of literary connection, but it was some kind of chronological connection. But what is it about the Hebrew culture that makes so we're getting off, like I feel like we've deviated quite a bit, because you said the Bible is true and reliable.
Yeah, I agree.
And now you're kind of cherry picking the idea of the Gospels, right? And saying that the Hebrew culture, understanding the Hebrew culture of around the turn of the millennium, would lead you to believe that the Bible is true. And forgive me, I'm not a Bible scholar.
So
I just need some clarification before I can continue.
I'll play defense here, Jimmy, because this is a Christian apologetic that gets brought up when we talk about contradictions in the Bible.
Yeah.
Right. He was preemptively bringing up the idea that genealogies are different, because that's a common criticism that gets brought up, and he's defending that these facts in genealogy being different are not necessarily an indication of the Bible not being reliable. So I think that's what Mikhail was trying to do here, and preemptively bringing up that fact. He wasn't necessarily hinging his entire belief in the Gospels. Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I could point to other things like you mentioned. Yeah, I think it was.
This does give me an opening, though.
How Mark didn't include that.
So this does give me an opening to talk about the Hebrew culture, though, right? And if we look at the Hebrew culture throughout the documentation, if you will, in the Bible, a lot of what they write is actually propaganda versus their oppressor. So in the Old Testament, you have a lot of propaganda that really bolsters the prominence of the Jewish people and kind of suppresses the prominence of the Egyptians and then the various civilizations that exist in Mesopotamia, whether it be the Babylonians or like the Assyrians. The New Testament is really not that different in that regard. This is a time period in where the Romans had just defeated the preeminent power of the Middle East and the Mediterranean, which was Egypt. And the Romans were the big kids on the block, and they were the oppressors of the Jewish state of Israel back then. And so you start to see this progression of supernatural detail as you go from Mark, which was written first, to John, which is completely different and entirely supernatural. It's almost as if as you go, through a progression in time, that the more traditional writing style wasn't doing enough to make the Romans look as bad as they truly were viewed by the Jewish people, or make the Jewish people seem as significant as they wanted to be depicted. And so they started adding these things. And all of a sudden, you've got a man born of a virgin who comes back from the dead is going to come back. By that point, the Jewish people don't even accept it. So there's a level of understanding international relations and the clashing of cultures around this time period where we have to say, well, were the Jewish people that were writing this, were they really being truthful, or did they have an agenda that aggrandized themselves and suppressed their oppressor? And I would have to go with the latter. Knowing what I know about Jewish culture and knowing what I know about the dynamics of the Middle East and the Mediterranean back in the Bronze and Iron Ages.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on a narrative that is nothing but propaganda against the Romans?
Sort of the Jews. Yeah. So Paul actually wrote a letter to the Romans, and what did he say do you know what he said in Romans chapter 3, verse 9? He said,
I actually don't know, but I'm not really sure how that, there are other books that were written, and this is a classic atheist response. I get it. But there's so many other books that are written that I would ask you, why is your book that there's only one source for? Why is that the thing that you're hinging your bets on? And it's not the fact that the Hebrew people have been oppressed from both sides for as long as they've documented. For the 1500 years that they've been writing the Bible, they were oppressed by the Egyptians, oppressed by the Babylonians, oppressed by the Romans, and they wrote stuff to oppose all of them. Isn't that a more comprehensive approach to look at the culture and the history, instead of saying I've got this one letter that was written, or this several letters that were written by people with an agenda that changes?
You could make that argument, but that argument directly conflicts with what Romans says, because Romans says that Jews aren't any better off and that we're all equally guilty. So Paul was actually writing to the Jewish people in Rome saying, okay, this gospel isn't for you, it's for everyone. So I would disagree with that and say that the Bible,
again, you're still turning,
especially the Gospels, weren't written. No,
you're still turning to a single source that has its own agenda.
Well,
right?
It's not. I'm trying to be charitable to Mikhail here, because I wouldn't say it's a single source, right? The Gospels are a different source from Paul, for sure.
Okay, no. What I'm saying is the Bible itself. While these sources are compiled,
yeah, but I don't think it's fair to say the Bible is a single source.
No, it's not. It's not. Yeah. I said it's a compilation.
Yeah.
But in what way are they verified, right? And in what way are they more likely to be a response to Roman oppression, a response to the oppression that the Jewish people felt? Why is that not the more likely scenario? Why are we now cherry picking these stories whose authors can't be verified and that don't have any corroborating sources?
Can I refine your argument, Jimmy? Because I think I concur with you. Here's what I would say. That I think might be a refined version of this argument, because I think like the Gospels each individually as a source, and the letters of Paul are different sources that also have their own agendas, right? And you've already made that clear in your arguments, and I think that's true, right? They have their own sort of narratives, their own sort of theological ideas that they want to put out there, et cetera. And so, like, I get this idea. Yeah, they're talking about different things. They want to put their own ideas. That still doesn't make me know that it's true, right? At the end of the day, because, there already are other Gospels, other books, books that people would call biblical, or at least are about Jesus, that didn't make it to the Bible for one reason or another. I'm not more convinced that the Gospels or the letters of Paul are something that we should take any more seriously than any other writings about any other Messiah at any other given point in time, right?
I would disagree with that, because I would say that, right, the Bible it's not just a book, and it's not just like you can't compare the Bible to Harry Potter and cross references. The Bible has 66,000 cross references. Sure.
Well, I don't think it's completely fiction in the sense that like Harry Potter is completely fiction, right? So that makes sense to me, right? But like that doesn't mean that it's all true. Like we were talking about Cyrus Teed earlier, who has his own followers who believe that he was the Messiah and had his own sort of Messiah story, and other people talked about it and believe it. I just think the Gospels are just that. There's somebody that followed a guy named Jesus a long time ago and wrote about him in the same way that cult people today would write about their leader, right? So I have a hard time disambiguating the Bible as different in that sense from any other sort of follower to cult leader narrative, right?
Yeah. So the Bible isn't, or especially with the Gospels weren't just written by, like, you can't just look at those and say, okay, they were written 40 years after. But if you compare the strategies that they were using in their writing to historians of the day, it's clear that they're making it reliable. They're proving it. They're saying, here are the sources. Here, go talk to these people. This is who was alive at the time. This is how long they ruled. It was during this time period in these places. If you look at the details of the gospel, then it's pretty clear that they line up with reality. And that's what we went back to, right? With the idea of, okay, what is truth? It's in accordance with reality. You can take any part of the Bible, take it out of context. Okay, it doesn't make sense. Put it in context, and it turns out that it's true. And you can look at it, and it's historically reliable as well.
So you're saying, Mikhail, that if we found another contemporary source with that of the Gospels that said, hey, here's another guy in Australia, for example, that wrote in the same way that the Aborigine people would write about history at the time, about a guy who rose from the dead and who performed these miracles, right? Because it's concurrent with the methods used by other historians at the time, that must mean we have to believe the stories of this person being the Messiah are true.
That's an interesting argument, but the problem is you could say that about Julius Caesar, right? You could say, okay, are we to believe Julius Caesar was true? But like,
yes,
there's statues of him.
But the problem is, though, the problem is I don't have issues with the claims of Julius Caesar existing in the same way I don't have claims about Jesus existing. It's about the things that he did, right? That's the bigger thing. And the fact that we have coins of Julius Caesar means that we know that he did at least something for their history, right? Like he was at least important enough in that way. The problem is we don't have the same sort of evidence that we do for Jesus or the various things that he accomplished.
Really? Because we have
Yes.
4 Gospels and we have a New Testament written all about him and what he did and what it means.
Okay. Do you know how many books there are in the Quran? Like, do you know how many chapters there are? Speaking of the Prophet Muhammad, it's very comparable. In fact, it's even greater than what the 4 Gospels have. I'll tell you that. Like, other people have religious writings about their leaders.
Yeah. Joseph, I mean, not Joseph, excuse me, Mikhail. I'm sorry. I called you the name of the like predating Jesus for thousands of years. We are still uncovering pillars, walls, monuments with the names of gods that existed for twice the time that Jesus has been around. And, they've been corroborated over many millennia in different parts of the world. So why is that not more feasible to you than 4 Gospels? Why don't you give credibility to the existence of the moon god Sin of the city of Ur? Like, why is that less credible? They were worshiping Sin for 2,000 years.
So Christianity is completely unique in that regard because every religion at the time and the time before that, and you could even say the time after that let me get back on track here. You can look at the religions, right? I've studied world religions. I'm sure you have as well. Every world religion, aside from Christianity, is a do this mentality, a think this mentality, or feel this way, right? In order to achieve salvation or whatever it is that they're arguing that they can give you, it's do this.
Correct.
But Mikhail, that has nothing to do with the value of its truth, right? Like, just because an ethos in the religion may be unique amongst like its other surrounding cultures, that doesn't make it more true, right?
Well, that goes into what a truth claim is, right? Because if you say 2 + 2 = 4 and I say 2 + 2 = 5, one of us is right and one of us is wrong.
Yeah, the ones that can demonstrate it are right.
Yeah, but that has nothing to do with history.
Yeah.
Like, just because Jesus had good things to say
gods coming down
and told people to act in a certain way, that doesn't make his life and the things he allegedly did more true.
I would disagree because you look at sorry, can you repeat that?
Well, okay, so the argument that you're making right now, and by the way, we're getting close to the end of the show, so just as a warning for you, because we got to wrap things up pretty soon here. Yeah. So, you're saying, well, the teachings of Christianity are different from other cultures and other religions that have existed prior, because, it teaches people to do things and act in a different way. And my counter to this is that has nothing to do with its truth value. In fact, it could be great advice and all the advice could be really awesome, but that has nothing to do with the historical facts of Jesus's life.
What do you disagree with the facts of Jesus's life? Because I don't
think he rose from the dead.
Right.
I don't think he could perform miracles. I don't think he was born of a virgin. I don't think he's the son of God.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you believe in probably not. No. Okay. So how much time do we have left?
Let's call it at like 5 minutes here. Just because, I think that's good enough time. Yeah. So
no worries. I mean, that goes back in my argument for the Bible that it's true doesn't just hang on the fact of its historical reliability, but its applications still apply to us today in a very real sense, to the point where it's like, okay, we are going to die. That's for sure, right? You agree we're going to die? Yeah,
I do agree. But Mikhail, I think that's the weakness of your argument, right? Because I think somebody who's a devout believer in the Taoist faith would find the Tao Chin books to be, incredibly enlightening and should be great for other people, right? And this isn't I'm not trying to dismiss your deeply held beliefs here in the sense that you don't think that this has been, a great teaching. It's more to the point that just because a great teaching exists doesn't make it the facts surrounding it more true, right? Like some of the worst people from history can make a great point every once in a while, right? That doesn't mean we should believe everything else that they say, especially when it comes to historical facts. And I think that's the problem, because in order for me to be a Christian, I think in order to be a Christian, and maybe you disagree, is that you have to understand who Jesus was and the things that he literally did, like in this world. And if we can't accept that to be true, if all we have are just teachings and sayings, then all we have are teachings and sayings. We don't have grounds to believe in anything more than that.
I would disagree. Well, so we have accounts that match up with history. It's not just the fact that his teachings were true and good. It was the fact that they pointed to reliable sources. They used writing strategies at that time that were right. They looked at, that's like saying, right, wait, do you believe Napoleon? Well, this goes back to kind of our argument with Julius Caesar.
Yeah. I mean, again, you can use, there's like ghost hunters that write in like pseudo, like scientific writing styles, right? That will post in like journals and stuff, right? That sort of emulate the way that real scientists do work, right? And that exists, and that's a thing, but that doesn't mean that their work is like more reliable just because it copies the same strategies that real scientists use, right? We have to examine the contents of it, right? And the fact is, we don't have any other historical sources that ever say that there was a guy named Jesus and he definitely rose from the dead and did a bunch of miracles. The only thing that we have is from Christians that have said this, right? People who were invested in the narrative and put that out there. We don't have secular sources that account for that.
You think that if a man living at the time where Jews were running the religious system, and a man running around saying things contradictory to their beliefs, do you think that if he died and rose again, that they'd want to write about it? And
well, first of all,
plaster that everywhere? No.
First of all,
500 eyewitnesses who witnessed Christ after his resurrection, and those
according to
are
the Gospels,
verifiable through other Greek manuscripts.
According to a non-eyewitness,
other Greek manuscripts.
According to one gospel that says there's 500 witnesses, and we will never be able to name a single one of them because we don't have a list of it. And that characterization of the system is very interesting because we're talking about a Roman occupied Jerusalem. So it's not Jewish people. I don't know what you mean by Jewish people running the system. I mean, there's definitely obviously Jewish prominence. That's why they talk about like
religious system.
Yes. They talk about the Sadducees, and I get that part of the narrative, but like there are people that, I mean, you could say the same thing about Mormonism. Like, oh my gosh, wow, Joseph Smith. Why would Joseph Smith go against the mainstream Christian America? Doesn't that mean that his stuff is more true? Because wouldn't it be embarrassing to be a Mormon and to follow this guy out west into Utah? I mean, like, you could make that same case, but it doesn't make Mormonism any more true.
You can find way greater contradictions within Mormonism. You can't find any in the Gospels. You've named a few, but if you really look into them and you look into the detail and you look at the culture of and you look at, okay, what were people expecting at that time? You can tell that they're historically reliable. And it's the same thing with, do you know the city of Jericho? Right?
Yes.
The city of Jericho wasn't mentioned anywhere else. It was only mentioned in the Bible, and they went out, archaeologists went out and they found the city. And usually when you would siege a city in ancient times, right, the walls would fall inward. But at Jericho, the walls fell outward. You can go there today.
I'm going to look that up.
The Bible come to life when you're...
Yeah.
So I'm going to look that up. You've said a lot of things that are just, they're sweeping generalizations, and they fit your narrative. The thing that you said about all other religions before Christianity, and forgive me if I'm putting words in your mouth, but you said something to the effect of they had an ineffective way of teaching people how to achieve salvation, or the methods by which were not as unique as that of Christianity. But Christianity borrows from its contemporary, borrows characteristics of the afterlife from many of its contemporary other religions, but also most of the religions back then didn't even teach you how to get to the afterlife. There was no progression with most of these things, with most of the religions and leading up to Christianity, and Judaism as well. There's no, you're going to go to the afterlife in Judaism, and there's going to be like a heaven-like state. So your sweeping claim about the character of all religions is factually incorrect. But I don't know that Jericho was never mentioned in anywhere other than the Bible. I don't know that that's true. I'm going to look that up. In any case, I just wanted to say that, that you might want some things to be true. Like I appreciate you wanting Christianity to be more unique than the other things. But the fact of the matter is Christianity developed as a religion, just like all other religions developed. There were some people who had some good ideas. They were convincing. They promised people some stuff, and they got more powerful because they promised that stuff to people who needed salvation, who needed a better way, who found community.
That's so false.
That's the way religion works.
That is incredibly false.
No,
that's incredibly false. They weren't spreading Christianity in order to benefit themselves.
Sure they were. Christianity offered an afterlife, unlike the religions that came before it. Christianity offered an afterlife, and it didn't even take deeds to do. All you had to do, it was the easiest way. It was the easiest way for a poor person or a sick person or someone who had been a slave or a gladiator to get a better life. It was to believe that some guy that rose from the dead did so for you, and all you need to do is believe it, and you can get paradise. No other religion offered that, and that's why Christianity was so unique, and that's why the poor are the ones that were targeted.
Why does Galatians 2:20 say, "I have been crucified"?
No, and I don't care. I don't know.
Sound easy?
Mikhail, I don't know what your dogma says. I just
we can talk about soteriology all day.
That's not, right? Not talking.
We have to wrap things up. We're out of time now. Mikhail, I'll give you 30 seconds here to give your last points of view, and I greatly appreciated the conversation today. Thank you so much for calling. This was very beneficial to me.
Thank you.
I'll give you 30 seconds here, and then we'll wrap it up. Thank you.
Yeah, so Christianity wasn't to benefit you. It was the idea, okay, you have to recognize that you're messed up. You have to recognize that you're a sinner. That's not an easy thing to do.
No, I'm not.
And then what does Paul say in Galatians 2:20? He says, "For I have been crucified with Christ." That doesn't sound like an easy thing. What Paul's saying is you have to die to your sin. You have to recognize that you're a horrible person. You can't do anything to outweigh the bad that you've done. And in order to achieve salvation, right, in order to be with God, what's the standard? He says it's perfection. We can't achieve perfection. The idea that Christianity is easy and that Christianity is just a gateway out of eternal death is false. It's because God loved us.
Okay.
God sent his son to die for us.
We got it, Mikhail. Thank you so much. We appreciate it. I would love to talk to you again, but this was a great in-depth conversation. I think the next time I talk to you, definitely want to talk to you more about these contradictions that you don't see in the gospel, specifically in the resurrection account, because I think that's where it's most egregious between the four. And I would love to hear a coherent narrative about what actually happens in the resurrection account, because I can't get that as somebody who has read all four gospels and is trying to track this stuff out. So maybe that's something we can explore at a different time. But until then, great talking to you. I hope we can do it again. And thanks for calling to the show. Wow. We're way over time, but I do want to talk about that, Jimmy, with you. What do you think of that conversation?
Well, I had a feeling that it was going to end up the way that it did. And Mikhail, if you're listening to this, if you're watching this, I mean this in all due respect. The message that you ended that call with is a horrible, horrible message to raise your children with and to try and convince people of. I am not horrible. I am not a sinner. I am not a bad person. I am a very good person. And there's nothing horrible about me. You know, I'm not going to, and this idea that God loved us. I mean, look, Dan, I don't need to pick apart all the ways that God is not loving, and I don't think we have time for that. But the argument devolved into preaching, which is where I thought it was going to go. Factually incorrect things said about the cultures. I think a misunderstanding about the cultures of that time and the power dynamics that took place in that region. But loved the call. And I appreciate that I was able to follow along for the most part, even though I'm no Bible scholar. And that was impressive to watch you and him talk about.
Well, I think that's my regret about the call. I don't want to get too deep in the weeds with these kinds of things. Unfortunately, Mikhail is obviously somebody who has at least studied the arguments, the apologetic arguments. And so I want to try to meet them where they were at. But unfortunately, it can lead to the effect of, if you're not already familiar with some of this stuff, it can be kind of hard to follow with it. So maybe in a different time, we can kind of like take a slower pace with it, you know, and like try to just focus on one thing at a time, because we did kind of dart around on a few different subjects there. But overall, I appreciate the call. I enjoyed it. Of course, you know, Mikhail being a Christian, he's going to give his Christian message at the end. So that's kind of par for the course for me. But at any rate, Flabbergasted is here with us and was making some comments in between. Sorry, Flabbergasted, because I didn't see your message until just a few minutes ago saying that you wanted to jump in on that. You're muted right now, my friend. He'll figure it out. There he goes.
Yeah, I wish I could have been like I'm a historian. I was a history teacher for a decade. Like it's so amusing to me how you get people who are these armchair historians who think they understand the nuances of the issues that they are making the crux of these arguments. And it blows my mind, because he ended up making effectively three arguments that I heard. Right, which is when the Bible's wrong, sometimes it proves that it's right when I want it to be. That some of the stuff is reliable, therefore the parts that I want to be reliable are also reliable, but won't apply any of these things, I guarantee, to any other text due to insert special pleading reason here. And then the third one is effectively conspiratorial thinking, right? It's true because of lack of evidence. If Jewish people run the system, why would they want stories about a Messiah? And that proves my point. And that's all I heard in that whole conversation from him.